Hey there, this is Steve Yerby. I'm the Scrum Master for Fortnite of Fury as well as Burlington Code Factory. So a few weeks ago, we were talking about our teams accepting stories earlier in the sprint. I started researching topics on and around the burn-up and ended up building this talk. I wanted to find the data behind the requests that came from our management and our stakeholders to get those stories across the finish line earlier in the sprint. So this talk speaks to the issues that my two teams were having and may not be applicable to all engineering teams at dealer.com. So if we start with the basics, we have our theoretical burn down. This, of course, is the best case scenario for burning down hours in a 2-week sprint. Theoretical burn up or acceptance of points can look like this, but more accurately should probably look something more like this. A stepwise burn up showing no acceptance over days 1 and 2 when all the first part of the work is being done, and then of course a gradual climb. So this could be our typical sprint, right? We have our theoretical burn down in blue, we have our actual burn down in red, looking pretty good there. So what do we see with regard to our burn up normally? Typically we see very little acceptance of stories earlier in the sprint than most of the work being accepted really late on Friday, Monday, and Tuesday, right at the end of the sprint. So we are being asked to solve a problem, and the issue is accepting stories late in the sprint. So why should we avoid the hockey stick, or why should we avoid stories being accepted late in the sprint? There's a later feedback loop. Stakeholders are getting late knowledge of the story completion. We are unable to pivot in sprint upon receiving the feedback if we get feedback from stakeholders or customers. The product owner is not seeing the work until the end of the sprint, so he or she is accepting those stories very late. There's a bottleneck of work, last-minute QA effort. We're also doing what's called iteratively waterfalling by accepting stories so late. We have an inability to respond to events late in the sprint. Maybe the dev environment goes down, or maybe more commonly, the developer is having local environment issues. The inability to respond to escalations, and then in turn, an escalation might be derailing completion of existing stories. So what does the manifesto say? Manifesto item number 2, welcome changing requirements even late in development. The agile process harnesses change for customers' competitive advantage. Manifesto item number 3, deliver working software frequently, from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with the preference to the shorter timescale. This could speak to the 5th bullet point example of the escalation derailing the sprint. So what do we currently do? On day 1 of the sprint, we gather, stand up, and we each grab a story that we want to work on. In this example, we have the first story being a front-end story, being grabbed by the front-end developer, and so on. Second story happens to be worked on by a back-end developer, so on and so on. And then, of course, day 1 starts, and then the QA sitting over in the corner by his or herself kind of bored. This is our QA engineer. So when stories are worked on in this manner, one person working on each story, each person may be working on that story for the entire sprint. So then on day 8 or 9, we find ourselves in that corner of the hockey stick, that example that I showed earlier. So the question is this teamwork, or is it just 5 people working in a pod? So how can we be more like a team? So option 1 I'm about to show, we're doing a pretty good job of already. We're making stories smaller and more digestible. For both my teams, we have a rolling team goal that states that we need to keep our stories at 5 points or less. Slicing stories vertically when refining and planning, having that full stack in one story, meaning back end and front end work so everyone can work at the same time. Obviously not every story this is applicable to, but do this whenever possible. Swarming on single stories, achieving that single story success, and we'll talk more about this in just a few minutes. So the first good example that I came across that was outside of the dealer.com world was in the banking industry, specifically ATM software. So in this example, the bank statement has a vertical slice, and the horizontal parts of that slice include the UI piece, the card reader, the security layer, probably worked on by the back-end developers, as well as the transport protocol, and so on. An example where we've done this successfully, where we've successfully vertically sliced a story, is a Mopar coupon story that we worked on for Shift or for Chrysler. You can see that we had a front-end developer front-end development work with the UI as well as the JavaScript. The back end, we're handling the services, and of course, we had quality assurance peppered in there. So when those stories are vertically sliced, we're set up for success when we swarm. We attack each story as a team. Instead of the first front-end developer attacking this first story alone, this team is trying to pair program whenever possible. This doesn't work for all stories, but for some it does. And the whole team doesn't need to work on the entire first story. In this example, we have the back-end developer working with a QA as she or he starts his or her test plan. All right. So when teammates swarm on stories early, we can achieve what's called single story success early in the sprint. In this example, we can see that first story getting across the finish line on day 2 on that Friday, and we're already seeing a theoretical burn-up moving in the right direction. What are the difficulties? Pair programming is not comfortable for everyone. You're stepping on your teammates' toes occasionally, I would imagine. Getting used to sharing the workload. Some people just like to put on their headphones and run with it. What else? So we saw this list a little bit earlier. If the goal is to avoid these, the later feedback loop, the bottleneck of work, the inability to respond to events late in the sprint, inability to respond to escalations, and then those escalations derailing completion of the stories that we're already working on. My question for you is, do we need to change the way we accept stories? This is something we should be working on, and then will swarming and vertical slicing get us there? So I appreciate you listening to this presentation today. I hope you pick something out of it. If you have any feedback or any input, please comment on this post or contact me directly at steveyerby@dealer.com. I hope you have a great day.